What if I told you that feminism is not the enemy, but the mirror that reveals where we as a society still have work to do? Feminism, a word that, in some rooms, lands like a whisper and in others, like a thunderclap. It is remarkable how a single word meant to advocate for equality can evoke discomfort, suspicion, even hostility. The problem isn't with the definition, but with the distortions that have grown around it. Somewhere between clickbait headlines, out-of-context sound bites, and social media outrage, feminism has been painted as a movement of anger, of bitterness, of division. Yet at its heart, it is none of these things. It is a response to inequality, to exclusion, to invisibility. And like all honest responses to injustice, it may be loud, it may be challenging, but it is not misguided. It is deeply rooted in the human desire for dignity and fairness. What's often overlooked is that feminism is not a rigid ideology. It is a conversation, a constantly evolving conversation that reflects the changing needs, voices, and experiences of people across the world. It doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It doesn't demand uniformity. What it asks for is balance, perspective, and most of all, empathy. Yet because it challenges systems that have long gone unquestioned, it is often labeled extreme. Feminism says, we need to talk about the pay gap, and it's met with, why are you making everything about gender? It says, we want to feel safe in our own homes, on the streets, at work, and it's met with, not all men. It asks, can we be seen, heard, respected? And it's met with accusations of overreaction. This pushback is not because the movement is wrong, it's because the discomfort of change often feels like an attack to those who benefit from the status quo. One of the greatest misunderstandings about feminism is the belief that it seeks superiority, not equality, that it intends to elevate women at the cost of men. This is simply untrue. True feminism doesn't want to swap power, it wants to share it. It doesn't view men as the enemy, but as essential allies. It doesn't vilify masculinity. It critiques the way narrow definitions of it have hurt everyone, including men. When feminism questions why boys are discouraged from crying, why male victims of abuse are overlooked, why men are more likely to die by suicide but less likely to seek help, it is not rejecting men, it is advocating for them. These are feminist issues too. Yet, too often, the conversation gets reduced to a caricature, man-hating women with loud voices and louder agendas. That is not feminism. That is a distortion, and it keeps us from engaging with the movement as it truly is. Another misjudgment is that feminism is only relevant to a certain class, gender, or culture. The truth is that feminism exists on every continent, because inequality does too. It takes different forms in different places: child marriage, lack of access to education, domestic violence, underrepresentation in leadership, gender-based workplace discrimination. The details shift, but the core issue remains the same: the belief, often unconscious, that one gender is more entitled than another. Feminism is not a Western export, nor is it a cultural threat. It is a local necessity in a global context. When a girl in a rural village fights to stay in school, that is feminism. When a man speaks out against harassment in his office, that is feminism. When a parent raises their child without forcing them into a box labeled girl or boy, that is feminism. These moments aren't always grand. Often, they're quiet acts of courage. But they add up, and they matter. What truly confuses many is that feminism is imperfect, and yes, it is. It has failed to fully include women of color, trans people, and other marginalized communities at times. It has overlooked those who exist at the intersections of race, gender, class, and ability. These are valid critiques, but to use those failures as a reason to dismiss feminism entirely is to misunderstand its nature. A movement can be imperfect and still be necessary. It can have flaws and still be the best tool we have to address the imbalance. The willingness to confront its shortcomings is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of maturity. It means the movement is listening, learning, adapting. Few political or social ideas allow that kind of vulnerability. Feminism does. And yet, because it questions comfort, it remains easy to mock, to belittle, to misrepresent. We must begin to distinguish between the noise and the message, between those who act in the name of feminism for personal power and the vast majority who do so for shared progress. Feminism is not a trend. It's not a hashtag. It's not a phase young people will grow out of. It's a lens through which we examine power, fairness, and the possibilities of a world built not on domination, but cooperation. If we peel back the layers of assumption and reaction, we find something deeply human at its core. The belief that no one should be less because of who they are, or more because of who they're not. That belief is not radical, it's rational. And until we can understand that feminism is a call to equality and not a claim to superiority, we will continue to misunderstand not just the movement, but the needs of the people it seeks to represent. From the moment we are born, before we even understand what gender means, we are introduced to rules, unspoken, invisible, and deeply entrenched. Blue for boys, pink for girls, trucks for him, dolls for her, be tough, be pretty, don't cry, smile more. These rules are not written in any constitution, but they are lived and reinforced daily through media, language, traditions, advertising, and even well-meaning parenting. They are gender stereotypes, and while they may appear harmless or even charming on the surface, they carry a weight that shapes how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. They are not merely labels, they are expectations that define what it means to be real men and real women. And what we often fail to acknowledge is that these roles do not uplift. They restrict, they pressure, and they hurt everyone, regardless of gender. For girls, these stereotypes often mean being told, either directly or subtly, that their value is closely tied to their appearance, their ability to nurture, or their willingness to be agreeable. From a young age, they are praised for being quiet, polite, accommodating. They are conditioned to prioritize others' comfort over their own. When girls express anger, they are scolded. When they assert themselves, they are labeled as bossy, difficult, or unfeminine. In school, they might learn to shrink their voices so as not to seem too ambitious, and in the workplace, they may be passed over for leadership because leadership still too often wears a masculine face. Even in friendships and relationships, girls can feel the pressure to be emotionally available, to take on the burden of others' feelings while neglecting their own. These are not small compromises, they are daily sacrifices that chip away at one's sense of autonomy and worth. But the pain of gender stereotypes does not stop with women and girls. For boys and men, the pressure is just as real, just as suffocating, though it wears a different mask. They are taught to be strong, not just in body but in spirit, to be dominant, stoic, in control. Vulnerability is seen as weakness. Emotional expression becomes a threat to their masculinity. Boys who cry are told to man up, as if emotion were a flaw to be purged instead of a natural human response. Sensitivity is mocked, empathy is discouraged, and in this silence, in this forced performance of toughness, many boys grow into men who don't know how to talk about fear or loneliness or sadness because they were never allowed to. They're taught to suppress, not to feel, and that suppression doesn't make them stronger. It isolates them. It robs them of connection, of intimacy, of peace. What's more devastating is how these stereotypes create a cycle of misunderstanding and mistrust between genders. When boys are taught that aggression is power and girls are taught that submission is femininity, the stage is set for inequality and imbalance. relationships suffer, communication suffers, society suffers. Women are told to protect themselves from male violence instead of men being taught not to normalize dominance. Men are shamed for needing help, while women are expected to be caregivers without limits. These assumptions reduce human beings into roles, not people, into masks that hide their complexity, their humanity, their individuality, and so many of us internalize these roles so deeply that we forget we're even wearing them. These stereotypes also leave little room for those who don't fit the binary at all: non-binary people, transgender individuals, gender non-conforming voices who challenge the very premise of either or. For them, the harm of gender stereotypes is not just emotional, it can be existential. It manifests in discrimination, in isolation, in laws that try to erase their identities entirely. When society builds itself around rigid roles, anyone who exists outside of them is treated as a problem to be solved instead of a person to be understood. This is not the failure of individuals. It is the failure of a system that insists on simplicity in a world that is inherently complex. We must also understand that these stereotypes are not just personal burdens. They are deeply political. They influence hiring decisions, wage disparities, healthcare access, media representation, and legal protections. When we say a man is naturally better at leadership or that a woman is better suited for caregiving, we're not simply expressing opinions, we're reinforcing systems of exclusion. We're teaching entire generations to limit their potential based on an idea as arbitrary as gender, and it's not just those at the top who pay the price, it's all of us. Every time a boy is discouraged from being gentle, every time a girl is discouraged from being bold, the world loses a little brilliance, a little honesty, a little truth about who we are and what we could be if we allowed ourselves the freedom to exist beyond the script. One of the most enduring misconceptions surrounding feminism, and perhaps one of the most damaging, is the belief that it seeks to reverse the power structure, to tip the scales so far in one direction that the result is no longer balance, but revenge. There's a suspicion that behind every call for equality is a hidden agenda to dominate, to silence, to replace. The idea that if one group rises, another must fall, that if women are given more opportunities, men will somehow lose theirs. This is not just an intellectual misunderstanding, it is an emotional one, rooted in fear, fed by defensiveness, and sustained by centuries of competition masquerading as hierarchy. But the truth is far simpler and far more generous. Equality is not superiority. Feminism does not ask to be above, it asks to be beside. It does not seek to erase, it seeks to include. Equality, in its truest form, is not about subtraction, it's about expansion. It's not about taking power away from one group and handing it to another. It's about dismantling the idea that power must be held by one group at all. It questions why we've accepted so few voices in leadership, in law, in business, in science, in culture, and it challenges the logic that fairness somehow means favoritism. When women advocate for equal representation, they are not suggesting men be excluded. When women speak about safety, about respect, about autonomy, they are not claiming exclusive rights to those experiences. What they are saying, what feminism is saying, is that these rights should belong to everyone equally. No one's gain should come at the cost of someone else's humanity. But the myth of superiority persists because it fits so neatly into the narrative many have grown up with, that power is finite, that if one group moves forward, another must be pushed back. It creates this illusion that inclusion is a threat, that change is an attack. And so, calls for equality are frequently recast as complaints, demands, or ultimatums. A woman asking to be paid the same for the same work is called aggressive. A man calling out sexism is seen as weak or disloyal to his gender. A non-binary person demanding visibility is told they're complicating something that was already fine. These reactions are not responses to actual superiority. They are reactions to the perceived loss of an unearned advantage. And it's that perception, not feminism itself, that fuels resistance. What gets overlooked in all of this is that equality isn't just moral, it's functional. When workplaces are more inclusive, they perform better. When leadership is diverse, outcomes improve. When education systems uplift all children equally, society advances. Yet despite the data, the emotional resistance remains. It's almost as if we've been conditioned to believe that fairness is unnatural, that equity is suspicious. Part of the problem is that many people have never seen true equality in action, so when it begins to emerge, it feels unfamiliar, even threatening. But unfamiliarity is not the same as injustice. What's actually unjust is the idea that progress for some must be a punishment for others. It is also important to recognize how this misunderstanding is weaponized. The accusation that feminism wants superiority is often used to derail conversations, to discredit legitimate concerns. It allows critics to shift the focus from systemic issues to personal insecurities. Instead of addressing why certain groups are underrepresented, the conversation gets hijacked into hypotheticals about what might happen if they were overrepresented. This kind of rhetorical sleight of hand protects the status quo by painting equity as extremism. It's a defense mechanism, but it's also a distraction, a way of avoiding the real work of introspection and reform. There's also a kind of fragility that reveals itself in the face of true equality, the kind that comes from having been unchallenged for too long. When a voice that's never been questioned is finally asked to listen, it can feel like censorship. When a privilege that's always been assumed is questioned, it can feel like oppression. But equality does not mean the end of your voice. It means the amplification of others. It means sharing the room, the resources, the recognition. And for those who have always had the microphone, that might feel like loss. But it is not. It is only the recalibration of a conversation that was never meant to be one-sided. When we conflate equality with superiority, we miss the entire point. We reduce a call for balance into a competition. We turn justice into jealousy, and we allow fear to dictate fairness. The truth is, feminism is not asking for anyone to lose so others can win. It is asking why, in a world of abundant possibility, we've chosen systems that divide rather than connect, that hoard rather than share, that silence rather than listen. And it asks not only for space, but for understanding. Understanding that power isn't meaningful unless it's inclusive, that strength isn't real unless it lifts others too, and that equality is not a threat to be feared, but a foundation to be built. Feminism is often received not as an invitation to understand, but as a provocation to defend. It is framed as a disruptive force, something hostile and intrusive, something designed to shame, accuse, or dismantle. And yet, when we look closely, without deflection, without defensiveness, what we find is not a weapon, but a mirror. A mirror held up to systems we've inherited, behaviors we've normalized, and truths we've learned to quietly ignore. Feminism, in its clearest form, does not threaten who we are. It reflects who we've become under structures that have shaped us unequally. And the discomfort that many feel in the face of feminism is not because it distorts reality, but because it reveals it. It asks us to confront questions we've long avoided. Who gets to speak? Who gets to lead? Who gets to feel safe? And whose pain gets minimized? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, and it is feminism that dares to ask them out loud. There is something uniquely unsettling about being shown a version of the world that contradicts the one you believe to be fair. For many, especially those who have rarely experienced marginalization. Feminism feels like an accusation. It feels like someone pointing out an imbalance you didn't know you were part of. But this reaction isn't a sign of feminist aggression. It's a sign of how rarely inequality is examined openly. Feminism does not create injustice, it exposes it. It does not fabricate stories of workplace discrimination or domestic violence or media misrepresentation. It simply names what has always been there, just beneath the surface. And that act of naming, of refusing to let these realities go unspoken, is often mistaken for hostility. But silence is not neutrality, and pointing to injustice is not the same as causing it. The mirror feminism holds up may be uncomfortable, but it is honest. That mirror does not reflect only women's experiences. It reflects society's patterns, failures, and blind spots as a whole. It reveals how limiting gender expectations are not just for women, but for everyone. It shows how men are trapped by ideals of dominance and emotional suppression, how entire generations have been raised to believe that strength looks like silence and leadership looks like control. It forces us to consider how normalized inequality becomes when it's dressed in tradition, or masked as biology, or softened by politeness. Feminism does not ask us to feel guilty, it asks us to feel responsible. Not responsible for history we didn't create, but for a future we actively shape every day through what we tolerate, what we question, and what we refuse to see. It does not say, "You are the problem." It says, "This is the problem. Will you see it with me?" And yet, because reflection is rarely easy, many choose to turn away. They dismiss feminism as divisive, radical, or unnecessary. They claim it's no longer relevant, that equality has been achieved, that those who still raise these issues are stirring up trouble where there is none. But this resistance isn't rooted in proof, it's rooted in discomfort. It's rooted in the human instinct to reject change when it threatens the familiarity of our world. The irony, of course, is that feminism isn't asking anyone to surrender their humanity, it's asking everyone to reclaim it. It's not about making people uncomfortable for the sake of it. It's about showing that the comfort we take for granted often rests on someone else's exclusion. That's not an attack. That's awareness. And awareness is the first step toward justice. The fear of feminism often stems from a deeper fear, the fear of losing control, of being seen differently, of having to unlearn habits that once felt harmless. But power that depends on someone else's silence is not power, it's imbalance. And peace that comes from ignoring reality is not peace, it's denial. What feminism offers is not a threat to harmony, but a new definition of it. One built not on who gets to dominate the conversation, but on who gets included in it. One where value is not tied to gender and dignity is not rationed. This vision does not require anyone to step down. It invites everyone to step forward. But to do that, we have to be willing to see ourselves and our systems clearly. We have to stop fearing the mirror, because that mirror doesn't lie. It shows the stories we don't tell, the promotions never given, the fears carried silently, the jokes that sting but go unchallenged, the policies written for some but not all. It shows the unspoken double standards, the subtle dismissals, the countless ways we've all been trained to accept less, for ourselves or for others. And what we choose to do with that reflection is up to us. Some will look and feel blamed. Others will look and feel awakened. But the mirror itself does not choose sides. It simply reflects what is there and challenges us to decide whether we will keep living by the reflection or change it. There is a kind of quiet that does more damage than noise ever could. It's the quiet of bystanders, of institutions, of cultures that have grown accustomed to overlooking pain when it doesn't affect them directly. It's not the absence of awareness, it's the decision to do nothing with it. Silence in this way is not passive, it is active complicity. And when it comes to injustice, especially gender-based injustice, silence becomes a structure all its own, one that shelters inequality, strengthens discrimination, and allows oppression to disguise itself as normalcy. When people choose not to speak, not to intervene, not to listen, they aren't staying neutral. They are allowing the systems of harm to continue uninterrupted. Every time someone stays silent in the face of sexism, harassment, or abuse, they create a space in which those things can thrive without fear of consequence. This silence does not always look like deliberate cruelty. Often it comes from fear, from discomfort, from the feeling that these issues are too complicated or not my place. But the effect is the same. When a colleague witnesses a woman being talked over in a meeting and says nothing, when a friend laughs along with a sexist joke to avoid conflict, when a teacher ignores a student's concern about discrimination in the classroom, each of these moments may seem small, but they are bricks in a wall that upholds injustice. In these silences, inequality finds protection. It finds room to grow, and it becomes harder for those experiencing it to believe that anything will ever change. Silence tells victims they are alone. It tells perpetrators they are safe, and it tells the world that this is just how things are. The most insidious thing about silence is that it often masquerades as peace. People say, "Don't stir the pot," or "Let's not make this political," or "Things aren't that bad." But those words are not peace, they are avoidance. And avoidance doesn't protect people, it protects power. For the person living with injustice, peace does not mean silence, it means safety, it means fairness, it means being seen and heard and valued equally. When we prioritize silence over truth, we are not keeping things calm, we are keeping them unequal, and we are sending a clear message that comfort matters more than justice. Silence also teaches the next generation. Children grow up watching how adults respond to unfairness. If they see that gender inequality is met with indifference or shrugged off as exaggeration, they learn that speaking up is pointless, or worse, inappropriate. They begin to internalize the idea that discrimination is something to endure, not challenge. That inequality is natural and therefore unchangeable. This is how silence becomes generational. It doesn't just maintain the status quo, it reproduces it. And unless we begin to disrupt this pattern by refusing to remain quiet, we are simply handing over the same harmful scripts to those who come after us. There is a personal toll to silence too. Those who remain quiet in the face of injustice often do so at the cost of their own integrity. They carry the weight of knowing they could have said something and chose not to, that they witnessed harm and opted for comfort instead of courage. Over time, this can turn into shame, a quiet kind of guilt that grows with every moment of inaction. It becomes harder to look in the mirror, harder to feel proud of who we are, and it becomes easier to rationalize our silence with excuses, with self-protection, with denial. But deep down, most people know when they've let something slide that shouldn't have. The question isn't whether we feel it, it's whether we act on it the next time, and there is always a next time. Injustice does not pause. It does not wait for a more convenient moment. It is happening in conversations, in offices, in homes, in headlines, in laws. It is happening in ways both loud and subtle, in systems both ancient and modern. And if we are not actively challenging it, we are allowing it. Silence is not an escape. It is a decision. It says, I see what's happening, and I choose not to disrupt it. I see someone being hurt, and I choose not to interfere. That may not be what we intend when we stay silent, but it is the message that is heard. And if we want to live in a world that is truly just, we must start by changing what we are willing to tolerate in our silence. We must stop waiting for the perfect words and start using the imperfect ones. We must stop assuming someone else will speak and realize that we are someone. Because the longer we remain quiet, the louder injustice becomes, and the harder it is to ever hear anything else over its echo. It's easy to look at the world's injustices and feel overwhelmed. The systems that perpetuate inequality, especially gender inequality, are vast and deeply rooted, woven into law, culture, media, education, religion, language, and tradition. It can feel like these forces are too big to fight, like the real work belongs only to policymakers, activists, or those directly affected. But the truth is, the fight for gender equality doesn't belong to a specific group. It belongs to all of us. It isn't just the job of women to speak up about sexism. It isn't just the job of the marginalized to explain why the systems around them are failing. It isn't just the job of those in power to dismantle what they helped build. Every person, regardless of gender, class, race, or position, has a role to play. Because the systems that create inequality are sustained not just by the decisions of a few, but by the silence, passivity, and complicity of many. Our role doesn't begin at the podium or on a protest sign. It begins in everyday choices. It begins in the words we use and the jokes we don't laugh at. It begins in the questions we ask our children, in the expectations we set for our peers, in the way we navigate conversations at home, at work, online. Social change is not only about legislation, it's about culture. And culture is made in the tiny, repeated moments of daily life. When someone corrects a sexist comment, when a man challenges his own biases, when a teacher adjusts a curriculum to be more inclusive, when a parent raises their child with the belief that respect has no gender, these moments may not make headlines, but they shape the foundation on which more visible change can stand. To play a role in progress doesn't mean one must be perfect or always have the right words. In fact, the most powerful role we can take is one of willingness, the willingness to listen, to learn, to be corrected, to be uncomfortable. No one knows everything, but everyone can learn something. The problem is that too often people let the fear of getting it wrong keep them from doing anything at all. They confuse imperfection with ineffectiveness. But silence doesn't protect us from mistakes. It just guarantees that we make none of the right ones. Playing a role in gender equality is not about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions, starting better conversations, showing up even when you're unsure. Progress has never come from certainty. It comes from courage. There is also the responsibility to recognize privilege, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something to be aware of. Privilege is not an accusation. It's a lens. It determines what we notice and what we overlook. Those who hold more societal privilege, whether through gender, race, wealth, or education, often have more influence, more access, more safety. That means they also have more responsibility. Being an ally isn't about rescuing others. It's about standing beside them, lifting their voices, making space where there was none. It's about knowing when to speak and when to listen, when to lead and when to step aside. And it's about realizing that being part of the solution means doing something even when the problem doesn't affect you personally. We all exist in relationships, families, friendships, classrooms, teams, workplaces, and in all of these spaces, we shape each other. We reinforce values, challenge norms, model behaviors. These are not passive environments. Every interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce the status quo or shift it. Sometimes the role we play is direct, calling out discrimination, mentoring someone who's been overlooked, challenging our employer's hiring practices. Other times it's quiet, choosing what stories to amplify, what voices to follow, what assumptions to unlearn. But every role matters. Change is not a solo performance. It is an ensemble effort, and no part is too small. Still, it's important to remember that roles evolve. What we can offer may shift over time, depending on our experiences, our position, our resources. But the role we play is not about being everything to everyone. It's about being honest about what we can contribute, and then contributing it fully. Some may lead movements, others may change their families, some may write policy, others may write poems, some may have power to shape institutions, others may shape hearts. The scale is different, but the impact is real, because transformation doesn't begin at the top. It begins anywhere someone decides that fairness is worth fighting for, that dignity should never be conditional, and that silence is no longer an option. That moment of awakening, of action, of responsibility, is how each of us steps into the role we are capable of playing.